Okay, so fittingly enough, we have been on a great journey since last September for many of you. And first of all, I want to say that I am very impressed with the number of people who are still coming after Easter, after the Easter sacraments. I think that's great. We only have a couple of things left. So tonight, next Wednesday, we do prayer and the spiritual life, and then we have a final celebration at someone's home with dinner that night. We do Mass that night too, so we'll have a Mass at the house, dinner, and kind of just a celebration at the end of the year. So before we get to prayer next week, this is a little out of order, but normally this is the last topic that I do. It's called eschatology in the formal study, the study of what we call the last things. So in Greek, the word eschaton means the end. And so when we start to think about the end, let's look at it in a sense in two tiers. You could talk about the end of the universe, everything that God ever created, that's one thing. And so most scientists, by the way, believe the universe has been around 12 to 15 billion years. So it's been around a while. Someone asked me on the trip to the Holy Land, Father, do you think that the world is going to end sometime soon? And I said, probably not. We may be around another 12 to 15 billion years. Now, whether there will be human beings on planet Earth at that point, and whether we will wipe ourselves out before that time is another question entirely, but that's not really the end. That's sort of what we do here for a period of time. But most of us are going to meet our eschaton, if you want to put it that way, the end, at the end of our life on earth, at the moment that we die, the moment that we breathe our last. So for us Catholics, the question becomes, or for any person, so what's going to happen at the moment of my death? And the first question that we ask is there anything beyond this life? And you know that there are people in this world who don't believe there's anything beyond this life. They think that death is the end. Some people don't know. It's a big question mark. But for us Catholics, we believe that death is not the end, but it is a transition point into eternity. So at the moment of our death, we will experience what we call a personal judgment.
How do you spell judgment? G-D?
Okay, I guess I should know how to spell judgment. So how many of y'all have heard about near-death experiences? Okay, so a lot of people have heard a bit about near-death experiences. One of the fascinating things about near-death experiences, they only started happening regularly in human history from the time that we discovered in the 1960s or so that we could resuscitate someone who had actually physically died. So their heart had stopped beating, they had stopped breathing, and sometimes there is even cessation of brain activity. So what they've discovered is that you can resuscitate people. There's actually a book by a famous doctor, Dr. Sam Parnia, called Erasing Death. And one of his areas of specialty is he studies the successful techniques around the world that are being employed to successfully resuscitate someone from death without having brain damage. So if they cool the body to a certain temperature and they do certain things in the process of reviving it, people can actually be dead for an extended period of time and be brought back to life. So people call those near-death experiences when people have awarenesses when their body is actually physically dead. Now he would say that they are post-death experiences because clinically they're dead, they're brought back to life, but some of those people describe experiences that they've had. One of the experiences that they often describe, by the way, is seeing a tunnel and a light and feeling warmth. And one of the other things they often describe is what they call a review of their life. They see their whole life kind of go by them, and they become aware not only of how they felt as things were unfolding, but the impact that what they said and did had on the people around them. So is that a taste of what we call the personal review or judgment of life? Perhaps it is. So at the end of our life on earth, we will know the whole of our life before the face of God. Now, could that be fearful? Definitely, because we're all sinners, we've all made mistakes, we've all harmed ourselves and others, so we're wounded human beings, so the prospect of facing judgment is a fearful thing as a human being. Now, from a Christian point of view, the thing that we always have to remember is that the view of God on us in eternity is from God's infinite mercy and love. So it's in the light of God's love that God will show us the truth about ourselves. And that's what gives us confidence, not to be afraid. So to be able to see the truth about ourselves without being terrified, that's the soul in the hands of God. So so that's our personal judgment. So at the moment of death, we will know our eternal destiny. And our eternal destiny, in the end, is only one of two ultimate destinations. One will either be, the words we use are heaven or hell, in the end. So a word about heaven and hell. What is hell really? Hell is an irrevocable choice on the part of the human person to reject God's free offer of salvation. That's one way of describing it. So what is the will of God for human beings? The will of God for all of us is to be saved. That's God's sole will for human beings. That's a core Catholic belief, by the way. Unlike the Calvinists who believe that God predestines some people to hell and some to heaven. So the desire of God from our point of view, God's desire is that every human person be saved. So the only way that we can lose that gift that God is offering us is a willful rejection that is persistent to the very end. In other words, God does not force the human person against our will to accept life with God forever. We are free to say no to that gift and to say it in the end in what we call a definitive way. So such a choice, by the way, is a choice that is a total turning away from God's merciful love. It's also a total turning away from the true self that God created us to be. And it's also a turning away from communion, the communion of love that connects us with other human persons and all creation. So it's a choice for absolute isolation. So at its core, and you can look through Christian history, there are all kinds of depictions of what the quote-unquote torments of hell are all about, from flames and fire to brimstone and so forth. But the chief punishment of hell is really ultimate isolation from God, separation from God forever. And again, that's a choice that God would respect if the human person made it. Now it's interesting, we Catholics have what we call a canon, a list of people that we believe are with God in heaven, but we have no such canon of the damned. So we have never said as a Catholic Church that we know for certain that any particular human person has now arrived at that destination. So we don't understand the depths of the human soul. Only God, in the end, can judge the human person at the depths. So we make no judgments as a church that we believe that anyone is in hell. That might surprise you, right? Because we've had some pretty um, pretty wounded human beings in the history of humanity who've done some awful things. And yet, there is the possibility for every human person to be saved. That's what grace is all about. So, at the same time, I think all of us also know we do have this core freedom about who we are. And we know that we're able to say no to love and reject God. We know that we're able to turn into self-centered, isolated human beings. So this is not just a theoretical thing, right? We know that possibility is not just out there in the world, it's also in me. And so we have to be kind of honest ourselves about the danger so that we don't fall into what we call presumption, presuming that God's going to save us no matter what. On the other hand, we should avoid the opposite of presumption, which is despair. And some people fall into despair and believe that God can't save them, that they're too awful for some reason, or they've committed too terrible of a sin, that God cannot forgive them. So between despair and presumption is the Christian virtue that we call hope. So we're invited to have hope in our destiny in the hands of God, God's ultimate mercy. So is it possible that no one is in hell? It is possible, other than the fallen angels. But we know that the possibility is real. All right, now what's the opposite of hell in terms of ultimate destination? Heaven, which is eternal communion with God forever. The joys of the human heart fulfilled beyond all measure. So every taste of joy, every taste of delight, every taste of happiness that we ever have in this world is but a foretaste of the infinite goodness that God has prepared for us. So Paul says at one point, I think it's Paul or maybe it's John, we are God's children now. What we shall later be has not yet been revealed. So we know that when it is revealed, we shall be like God, for we will be, in a sense, made one with God. The Eastern Church, by the way, speaks about the human person on a journey towards what they call divinization, that God is going to draw us into his own divine life. So God will share his own divine life with us and we'll become partakers of that divine mystery. So St. Thomas Aquinas spoke about what we call the beatific vision, the vision of God that we see forever in eternity. I will also add that when you look at Christian art, especially medieval art, check this out if you want to test me on it. But the great works of art that depict hell are always much more interesting than those that depict heaven. A human being's imagination of expressing torments and tortures seems to be a lot more proficient than depicting in visible form the delights of heaven. So it's sort of funny that we have a limited imagination that way. In fact, some people have such a limited imagination about heaven, they don't want to be there. One person said to John Wesley, I think it was, what should we do in heaven? And John Wesley said something like, we will praise God for all eternity. And he said, that sounds boring to me. And John Wesley said, well, with that attitude, you probably don't have to worry about it. So the joy of heaven is beyond all telling. But I believe this. If you look around at the universe God created here, how beautiful it is, and how good human love is at its best, God has not created heaven to be less than that, right? This is but a foretaste of the infinite that God is preparing for us. So we should never imagine that earth is going to be more interesting than our eternal destiny with God. It's quite the opposite, actually. So Christian theologians have tried to express what it might be like. I tend to like C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia, the last book, The Last Battle. They go up into the mountains, and it just gets better. They don't feel tired. It's more and more beautiful, higher up and higher in. And Lewis also wrote a book, I think it was called The Great Divorce, and they get a chance to tour heaven, and they get off the bus in heaven, and it's too real for them. You know, the grass is too real. It almost hurts their feet to step on it, and the light is too bright for their eyes, and it's sort of like heaven was almost too real. They're like, let's just get back to earth because it's too much for us. You know, we can't tolerate this goodness. Have you all seen the film What Dreams May Come? Came out several years ago, and the basic premise is, I think a woman takes her life, and she ends up in darkness and gloom. It would be what we would call today, the Catholics would call it purgatory. I'll say a little bit about that later. And her husband wants to rescue her and get her to heaven. And so when they first enter into heaven, it's what they think it's going to be. It's their picture of paradise. But once they get further in, it becomes more than they imagine. So, you know, maybe the God in the beginning of our journey into the kingdom of heaven will reveal the goodness of himself and the new heavens and the new earth in a way that we can delight in, that we will immediately know this is heaven, but God will draw us to better things and deeper things and richer things and fuller things. So no one has ever given us a description of heaven other than the mystics who have spiritual experiences and try to describe these things. So what it will actually be like, we can only imagine here in this world. But we do believe that every desire of the human heart will be fulfilled, and there will be, as Paul puts it, or Revelation, no more weeping or wailing, but God will be all things in all. And we do believe, by the way, that it will have a physical dimension. The New Testament speaks about a new heavens and a new earth. We speak in the Apostles' Creed about what we call the resurrection of the body, but these bodies that we have here are still subject to tiredness and sickness, and our glorified bodies, whatever glorified bodies are, will not be subject to those limitations. They will be fully alive. So that's sort of a foretaste, an attempt to describe what the mystery of heaven is like. It will also be communal, so we're not going to be isolated and alone with God, but what we speak about as the communion of saints, all of God's creation will be able to enjoy the company of each other. And someone said, well, will I know people that I loved in this world? Well, my answer to that is always, I suppose in heaven we're going to have more knowledge and love than we have here, not less. We're not going to become stupid when we die, right? So yes, we will know those we've known and loved in this life. In fact, we'll know them and love them in a way that we've never been able to in this life because of our own limitations and their limitations and the limitations of creation. So a communal dimension. In the end, any attempt to describe it is trying to describe mystery. So we can never fully capture what the mystery of an eternity of happiness with God will be. But it's worth pondering it to instill in us a desire to be there someday and deepen our hope and longing for that eternal joy. And I think that every delight, true delight and healthy joy and goodness that we experience here is preparing us for that ultimate joy with God forever. So think of your happiest time on earth, the time you felt most free to love and be loved, and when you thought, wow, life can't get any better than this moment. I think that's a foretaste of heaven. All right, so personal judgment at the moment of our death. We will know at the moment of our death what our eternal destiny is, whether it will end up being heaven or hell. If it's hell, we'll immediately be separated from God forever. Some of us, if we die in what we call a state of perfect sanctity, will be immediately with God in the joys of heaven. But most of us are probably going to have some mixture, that we're not going to be fully ready for God, although we've not definitively rejected Him. And we will experience, prior to our entrance into heaven, a process that we Catholics call purgation, or purgatory. And purgation is a form of suffering that purifies us, that cleanses us, that prepares us to be free from our disordered attachments to sin. So, if I were to die right now, I would hope that I'm not separated from God for all eternity. That's my hope. Am I completely filled with God's love? Am I free from all the vices? Are all the movements of my heart properly ordered toward love? Not yet. So, the mercy of God will enable me at the moment of my death to have God begin to heal me. Now, to let go of self-centeredness is sometimes painful, isn't it? That's the kind of suffering that purgatory is. It's when I don't want to let go of my selfishness, but I need to. And that suffering of letting go of it, that's purgation. Sister Lauren Cole was a sister that I worked with at St. Matthew and Father Ryan years ago. And she used to always tell the kids, when she talked about purgatory, she would say, if you go into someone's house that has a very nice house with a clean carpet, and you've been playing in the mud, it's probably good to get cleaned up before you walk on the carpet. And so God's inviting us into His home forever, so He cleans us up so we can come in clean. The image that I like to use is when you go see a movie in the middle of the day, and when you walk out of the dark theater, if you were to walk straight out into the sunlight, you couldn't do it. It hurts your eyes. But if you have a lobby to go through to get to the outdoors, your eyes get adjusted to the increasing light. And it hurts sometimes, when you've been in the dark, the pain in your eyes from sudden bright sunlight. So my vision of purgatory is sort of like we're journeying through the lobby into heaven. So two mistaken notions about purgatory. Some people mistakenly thought in the past that purgatory was like God putting you into hell for a short window of time, like a toast on a toaster, and then you pop out ready for heaven. So not the same. The sufferings of hell are totally different than the suffering of purgatory. So nothing to do with each other, different kinds of suffering. The second thing is some people thought that purgatory was the testing ground, and from there it would be decided whether you would go to heaven or hell. Not so. Everyone in the process of purgation is on their way to the kingdom of heaven. So once you're in purgation, God is purifying you for entrance into the kingdom. You're not being prepared for eternal separation from God. So your fate is already, your ultimate destiny is already clear. So that's the deal with heaven, hell, and purgatory. So at the moment we die. Now, there's another very important thing to say. And the important thing to say is that while that's true for me when I die, God doesn't just have plans for us as individual persons, but God has a plan for all of creation. So Paul says at one point, all creation is in agony, it's groaning, and it's waiting to share in the freedom of the children of God. And that's where the book of Revelation talks about the new heavens and the new earth. So we believe that this beautiful created world that God created out of nothing is someday going to be transfigured into the new heavens and the new earth. So God doesn't create anything without purpose. It has an infinite value. And so at some moment, at the end of all world history, all cosmic history, all that is will be transfigured by God. And there will be a new heavens and a new earth. And that's when we're going to have what we call the general judgment and the general resurrection. So you may not know it, but from the point of view of us human beings living in this world of time, which has a before, during, and after, from our point of view, at the moment of our death, if we're going to be with God in heaven, our souls, the spiritual essence that we are, goes to be with God. There's the communion of saints, of souls with God forever. But at some moment, and the prayers of the funeral liturgy say it, God will raise our bodies and make them incorruptible, or Paul speaks about them as spiritual bodies or resurrected bodies, much like the body of Jesus raised from the dead. No longer does death have power over that body, but Jesus can appear and disappear at will. He can be visible and manifest himself, but also be veiled in mystery, so he's not recognized. So we will have resurrected bodies, much like the resurrected body of Jesus. And so at the end of time, the resurrection, all will be raised from the dead, not just souls with God, but embodied beings in the new heavens and the new earth. And what we call the general judgment takes place at the end, when not only do I know my own destiny, but my destiny is known to everyone, and vice versa. So everyone's universal, outcome is clear to everyone. So there will be no secrets. And so you might say to yourself, well, if it was embarrassing to think that God will know my whole thing, he already does anyway. What about everybody else knowing all of my sins and failures? Well, remember, we're all in the kingdom at that point, God willing. And so we all see each other with the merciful eyes of God then. So we understand the weakness and the failures and the sinfulness of the human condition in the context of the greater love and mercy of God. So love triumphs, and we're able to see the truth about each other without judgment or without the brokenness that we experience in this life. So that's sort of a foretaste of general resurrection. Now we'll also add one final thought, which is once you enter into eternity, there is no before, during, and after. So time ceases once you cross the boundary of death. So for us here in this life, let's say when I was 30, my grandmother that I was very close to, and she died. I've missed her for 25 years now. It seems like a long time that I've been waiting to see my grandmother. But from the perspective of my grandmother in eternity, from the moment of her death until my arrival in the kingdom might be the twinkling of an eye. So, what happens in eternity is totally different than the human experience of time in this life. So we shouldn't think that they wait like we wait. And I did think, by the way, that the movie, what was that movie that came out last year? The Shack. Did a nice job with that because you could see Jesus playing with the children, and do you want to go back now? It won't seem that long to her. This wait is not so infinitely long for those who are already in the kingdom. So those are a few reflections about what we call eschatology, what happens in the end. So any questions? John.
Explain being in heaven and the distant body experience after the resurrection.
So what might it be like to be in heaven as a soul prior to my resurrected body versus resurrected body? I cannot explain what that might be like different. And I suspect that from the perspective of us when we die, from the moment we are with God in heaven to the moment of our personal resurrection is going to seem like the twinkling of an eye too. So how much quote-unquote experience of a disembodied soul we'll have, I'm not sure. If I could put it that way, yeah.
Have you read Imagine Heaven?
Imagine Heaven, I have not read. Good book?
Everybody read Imagine Heaven.
Okay.
It's a good book.
Makes you imagine it, huh? Okay.
How do you fit in that? We quote unquote, we can't earn heaven by good works on this earth, but rather God's grace, God's mercy that allows us to have that. You were flirting with it a little bit about how you were in this life as opposed to, and it's going back to the works. Was I good? How's that?
So here's the deal. None of us can earn heaven. It's always a free gift of grace from God. Totally free, unmerited on our part. So we don't earn it. It's not like we have to do a certain number of good things to get there. It's not like we're trying to build up points with our airline to get to a long enough trip to get there. It's totally different than that. It's totally God's grace. But here's the mystery. We can refuse to accept that gift. It's a free gift from God, but God will not force the gift upon us. So to be saved involves accepting the free gift of God, so we can cooperate with the grace of God. And in fact, once we begin to say yes to God, God's love begins to transform us, and we become filled with God's own love, and so we become people of love. So all the goodness of our actions flows out of that living communion with God's love for us. So it's not like it's not like I've got to do all these good things to somehow earn God's love. It's that God's love grasps me and transforms me, and because I'm transformed by that love and I've said yes to it, thus I become the love and actions of love that God created me to be. Does that help?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Rebo, how did the concept of purgatory develop? Was it tied to scripture, or was it
All right, so how did the concept of purgatory develop? So, two elements. One is in the book of Maccabees, which is accepted by Catholics but not by Protestants, because it was not in the Hebrew canon. It's in what we call the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which, by the way, the New Testament, when it quotes the Old Testament, is quoting from the Septuagint, so the early Christians used the book of Maccabees as well as the other books of the Septuagint. There is a story about those who are fighting on behalf of God, and they die for God, but when they go to bury the bodies, they discover that they were also wearing amulets to other gods or idols underneath their clothing. So that would be a grave sin, right? You violate the greatest commandment, you shall have no other gods before you, but they were fighting for God, so they had not been totally turned away from God, but on the other hand, their hearts weren't totally for God. So what happens to those people? So in the book of Maccabees, Maccabeus says, let's pray for them that God will indeed bring them to the resurrection of life. So the belief that was that our prayers for those who have died that are in purgation can assist them in getting into heaven. So that helps them to be purified or cleansed. So in fact, the earliest Christians always pray for those who had died. So it's that practice of praying for the dead that is the basis of the belief in purgatory. Now why do I say that? Because if you're in heaven, you don't need prayers. You need nothing in heaven. So you don't pray for someone who's in heaven, they don't need your prayers anymore. They have everything they need. If you're in hell, prayers don't do you any good. You can pray for a person in hell forever, but it doesn't change their eternal destiny. So the only people that you pray for after death are those who are in purgation. So it's the practice of praying for those who have died that was the root soil of the Christian belief in purgatory. And to me, it just makes a lot of sense. I think if 99% of us were honest, we know that we're not totally filled with love yet. There's still some clinging to negative things that are not like God in us. So if I were to die at this moment, I need to be aware, that I have to let go of that. And God's going to do that for me by grace if I haven't rejected God totally. The other 1% enjoy immediate efforts in heaven. Yes?
In this line of thought, could you address the idea of the communion of saints and prayer back and forth between the...
Yeah, I can say a word about communion of saints, which I did talk about the night we did Mary and the Saints. But we're still in this living relationship with all those who've gone before us. So those who are now in heaven with the Lord, we believe care about us, they're praying for us, and we have a real relationship with them. We can ask them to pray to God on our behalf. And we also believe we have a living relationship with those in purgation. So we can also pray for them. And our love for them, our prayer for them, is transformative. It sets them free. So that's why it's good to pray for those who have died. So we're all still connected together.
So what if we're alive when the second coming comes? So what happens to our body?
All right, so if you're alive when the second coming happens at the end of time and the consummation of all creation, you will be raised at that moment, body, mind, and soul, to God if you're ready for Him. So you'll be purified and raised, you'll get instant resurrection from the dead.
So you will die, per se, right? Your human body.
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, are you gonna really,
Oh, that's a good question. So if you're still alive when he comes, you might go straight to him without dying.
I just when we think about what our Lord said, that we have to be composed like a Heavenly Father.
Mhm.
And that gives us a sense, we know we're not composed like a Heavenly Father. So that gives us, if we die in that moment, it makes sense and needs to be true.
Mhm.
We will be made true.
Right, it does make sense to me too. Yeah, because I don't think that I'm totally godlike yet. Purely. Now I do have moments when I know that I am more open to God and more godlike than other moments. I also have other moments that I know I'm being more childish and self-centered. Not so good. Yes, I have awarenesses of these moments in my life.
you gotta tell us a good story from your trip, at least one.
All right, a good story from the trip. Okay. All right, so, just a few things about going to the Holy Land. And I'll try to do a presentation on it and show some of the pictures at some point. But the few things that I will say are, you will never hear the Bible or read the Bible again the same way. Because every time you hear a story, you'll picture a place in your mind. You'll never pray the rosary again in the same way, because every mystery of the rosary, you'll start picturing a place where they commemorate that mystery. So it puts you in touch in a very living way. What happened on this trip for me, it's my second trip, I had this new awareness. Like when you were in college and you met someone who became a dear friend, or perhaps was your girlfriend or boyfriend, and you really wanted to get to know the person and get to know their family, go to their hometown and stuff. And then you felt like, oh wow, I really know this person because I've been to their hometown, I know them. I had this sensation with Jesus on this trip. You know, Jesus, I'm getting to know you better because I'm walking where you walked. You know, I'm seeing where you got on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. Here's the ruins of Capernaum where you made your base for 3 years, and here's the house of Simon Peter. You know, here's maybe the Mount of Beatitudes where you spoke the Sermon on the Mount. Here's Mount Tabor, maybe, where you were transfigured. Here's your hometown, Nazareth. Here's Bethlehem, where you were born. Here's the place where your cross was. Here's the place where the tomb was, where you rose. It's like I'm getting to know Jesus in a very intimate way because I'm getting to go to all of his places, as it were. And I had that really close connection, awareness on this particular trip. 2 places struck me more than any other on this trip. One was, and I shared it last Sunday at Mass, on the Sea of Galilee. So we read the story about the stilling of the storm and the walking on the water, and then they played these beautiful hymns. We were sitting around the boat, and I was sitting on the boat, and I suddenly just became very aware, you're with me, Jesus. You're the risen Lord, you're here with me in this boat. I am in your backyard, this is where you lived for 3 years, and swam, and played and fished, and spent time with your friends, and you're here with me right now. I had this very palpable awareness that he was with me. The second place that I had that palpable awareness, there is a church called St. Peter Gallicantu. It's a French church. St. Peter where the cock crowed. So that church is built over the ruins of the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where Jesus was taken on the night of Holy Thursday after he was arrested. And when they excavated beneath the ruins of Caiaphas' house, you know what they discovered under the house? They discovered the dungeons, the pits where prisoners were held. They even saw marks in the rock walls where manacles were placed. And one was a very deep, about 12 feet deep pit. And they would either lower the prisoner by ropes into the pit, or they would actually sometimes push them off the stairs and make them fall 12 feet down to the bottom of the pit. So these days, you go down to the bottom of the pit, and 10 years ago when I went, they turned all the lights off, and we stood in the pit in darkness to imagine if Jesus were held here in this pit overnight, what would it have been like for him to be down in this pit in darkness overnight? So this time they didn't turn the lights off, but we read Psalm 88. Now, I don't know if you know very much about the 150 Psalms, but every Psalm of the Old Testament, almost every Psalm ends, even the ones that are about darkness or sickness or grief, they always end on a positive note. But Psalm 88 doesn't. It ends with, you have left me, I'm totally abandoned, you've left me in darkness. That's how the psalm ends. So we read that psalm in the pit. So I suddenly, when I was in the pit reading that psalm, we all read it very prayerfully, and everybody started leaving the pit, going back up above ground. And it was down there, and I suddenly realized I hate to be left behind. I hate to be abandoned. That's one of my core fears, you know. So like if I'm lost and I can't find the people I know and love, and I feel left behind, that for me is like my chief fear, right? So as I'm standing down this pit, and I see everybody leaving the pit, I thought, I don't want to be the last one out of this pit. And then I stopped and I thought, no. I thought, Jesus, if you spent the whole night here by yourself, you were abandoned by your friends that night in the Garden of Gethsemane. You were alone in the dark. And he even felt in Mark's Gospel abandoned by the Father. You know, my God, why have you abandoned me? So he had the experience. So I thought to myself, I thought, Jesus, you knew what it was like to be abandoned. So I'll never be abandoned, because when I feel abandoned, you're here with me in my abandonment. So I want to stay here in the pit alone with you. So I waited and made everybody leave the pit so I could be alone down there. And that was the place I felt very close to Christ. I thought, you're right here with me. I'm with you in this pit where you were left abandoned, and you're with me. Now then I saw one of our pilgrims. She really wanted to stay down behind after everybody with her camera take some pictures. So I said, okay, come on. And that's why I didn't stay until the very end, but I had the moment to know the truth that the Lord wanted me to know. So yeah, those are two of my profound moments. And I'll leave it. Yeah. We went to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. We had Mass in the church where the rock is, that they believe he had his agony. Yes, take this cup away. But the altar is built right over it. So that's the beautiful thing about Masses. You celebrate Masses in all the locations where things took place. So you're on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. We read John 21. Do you love me, Peter? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. So I celebrated Mass early in the morning, and all the people were looking at the Sea of Galilee while we were praying those readings and prayers. So those kind of moments are unbelievable. Being on the Mount of Beatitudes, that's where our guest house was overnight. So early in the morning, late in the evening, when everybody left, it was peaceful. I could walk through the gardens alone and pray and look out over the Sea of Galilee. It was peaceful, quiet, contemplative moments were also very profound. If you ever get a chance to go, right? Wouldn't y'all say? Yeah, the Dollins are ready to go again. Yeah, it will change your life if you're open to it. I could see it on everyone's faces. Some people, by the way, call the Holy Land the fifth gospel because it brings the four first gospels to life so much. It's like, wow, it's the fifth gospel. All right, any other questions? Heaven? Hell? Any choices? On the Feast of All the Saints, by the way, there's a beautiful reading in the Office of Readings, and it says the saints are so desiring us to be forever with them in the joy of God. Why are we so sluggish on earth? Why do we let ourselves get distracted by so many other things that seem joyful but aren't really very joyful? That's one of my favorite readings. It kind of inspires me. Let's remember what we're here for. Remember why God created us. But the deep truth is this. Once I've been claimed by Christ and I've said yes, and God's grace begins to work in me, I don't have to wait till after I die to taste the kingdom. I already get to experience foretastes of eternal life here and now. The risen one is with us. You know, I get to experience in every authentic moment of joy, love, grace, peace, and service already kind of a connection with what I'm created for, to be in heaven forever with. So we don't have to wait until after death. We start that now.
I always like the thought of Jesus, bring the next generation today, we need to
Yes.
And I always thought of that as being, that is designs that we didn't say anything the other guy. He said, we're just a little bit.
Yeah. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom today. I say to you, you will be with me in paradise. Yeah. Yeah. But to the other, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. To the others. It's so beautiful. Okay. So, shall we close with prayer and we have discussion at tables? Or should I keep them longer so that we're not in any rush to get back and see this Predators play out? Our glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And O God, draw us all to yourself, that we may enjoy forever the glory of heaven. Through Christ our Lord.